Alright, that's what that digi to that dunga se tablam the canese or se dunga canese or digi can stupure sache. That is all on the decor. The mule must not all what the digi to Vietnam and tablam and because of dunga se needy. Tis that dunga se that dunga se vena and digi rashing lay or dunga meva sena digi lay on it. Dine zada dunga meba suyala, dunga meba canis sure la du, tangas number sangibi chini shedun, so simgitone and simlia gomje, simgitone and dunga meba sures. The Garisena, Suga de Garrison, Simginana Garrison, Lo, Nyomo Barik, Duacha, Condro, Naja, and it is Chazan Junset Dazin Marikpa said disolatin ligore, disol young Razuya. Dunga gudi tires, then the gudi meba sojabaina, and dunga mares, dunga young mares. Dunga mebaina and digire, the young grace. Then the negi on those in that Mazuki, you had the sugarwa.
Good evening. So we're continuing to talk about how to attain happiness. Both temporary, but in particular lasting, stable happiness, as well as how to eradicate suffering. So the objective is to attain a state freed of pain, freed of misery, because if suffering is completely eradicated, all one experiences is mental peace, calm, tranquility, happiness. So the method to achieve such a state is to transform our mind. And what does it mean to transform our mind? It means to eradicate completely all our afflictions, such as anger, attachment, pride, jealousy, and so forth, all of which arise from the ignorance of self-grasping. And this self-grasping being the root cause of all our afflictions, all our suffering, this is what we need to eradicate. And when it is eradicated, when the root cause is eradicated, no resulting suffering will be experienced, which means we'll abide in a state of lasting peace, lasting happiness.
And in the Zamlina, me nada, Dundoina, Chasan, Dachik, Dundoina, Horosik, Lagachi, or what was Milina Lagaligore, and the chicken as Mille Lagalena, Cassin, Ton Jagore, Chasin, and the chick Kumakugore, Cashin, and the chicken, as the chick Lagaligore, Cashin, and the chick. Shingle Shada, and Kashiki, Lobjon Shada, this one and Kashiki Church. Chasan J, the Mu Dunda, Mu Carson, Dunga said it. Chasan D. Dundalia, Dunga said, and Digion Dundala, Lagat, Tablum Chasan D to Gore, Tablum Zizi or Chasan, Chasan Digi to the Dunga said, and Digi to Dundal Jigorwa. Chasan Digi to the Dunga say, Tablum de la Lagalea down Song Jala Sobada, the Chitamar, Yubi Nane. That Semgutone Gom Japche, Semgi, Nyomo Boyon Diki, Casore, Dumoyo, Guganerse Shas, Gudi Dambo Shimjuche, Sejetan, and Gudi and Semgit and Yungu Bade, Semdegaras and Tuacha Kondonga Yomoba, Desolatine and Dunga Di Yungu and Ding Water, that Di Mebazola Canis Meva Sugaresene, and Chi and Menji Tone Mevasua Mevare. That then the same Gutone, same Gomje, Yamnji, Di Docho, Nyomo, but Tuachaki Docho delia, Lo Shandachi, Lo Shambachi, Koroga Docho, Lo Jamzela, so the Niki Docho, Lo Dipa, Gomjen, Mevasuko, Dinezang Chazada, Dinane, and the Dunga say, Taplam Yashodi, and the same meeting of Gom Japchi Mevasuadi, Yashore, such on the Nanzuki, San Jimnendiki, that Yashu Dirius and Tablam didn't go wrong on.
All beings throughout all worlds, whether humans or animals or unseen beings, all want happiness. And in order to attain happiness, they engage in a wide variety of activities. And this variety of activities is focused on eradicating suffering primarily in order to attain happiness, as well as activities specifically to attain happiness. So this is the case for all beings. And it's the same, of course, then for us too. whatever work you engage in those activities of work, whether it's in an office, or whether it's in a factory, or whether it's outdoors. One engages in that so as to eradicate problems in your life and attain happiness. When one is engaging in education, one does so with the motivation to become educated in order to eradicate suffering and experience happiness. And whilst many of these activities are required, the problem is they don't deal with the root cause of our suffering. The suffering we experience comes from our afflictions, the arisal of anger, jealousy, pride, and so many others. These are what cause us to suffer. And these all come from a root cause, a single root cause, the ignorance of self-grasping. And these external activities we engage in, whilst they do have an impact on our suffering temporarily and our happiness temporarily, the impact they have on the cause of our suffering, our afflictions and their root cause, the ignorance of self-grasping, is minimal to non-existent. Rather, where we need to put more energy in is to transforming our mind. In addition to engaging in external activities, we need to reprioritize, gain a balance where our primary focus is on transforming our inner world, developing minds that are opposite to the afflictions. So, for example, developing love, which is an antidote for so many afflictions, but primarily that of anger, as well as developing other virtuous minds, such as contentment and so forth, as antidotes to attachment. And of course, developing wisdom, which the Buddha said is the very best of all methods.
Depende kondo kewe ne nga zo lia kanga yungu yo bati nga zo sebo ha hudu ra shen ni kala kanga tewe yo jengi yo bati sebo ha hudu ga sina nga je da de sha je we na de ni ki sebo ha hudu da jesu ga chasan ganesh jungure sin da se marik batene li yo re se ko shimju che ya de da se marik batene de li yo re se ji da de do se shimju ga ganesh da se marik pa sin da ga se na nga sebe nga ra shin nga simbe nga ra shin nga sebe samlo de 지사 나시베 삼노데 두 쳇데 나주게 직되샤게 당 홍도게 당 아게게 두 차상도 수용한주 심주를 쳇데 나시베 삼노 지어봐자 델라데니 리용은 나시베 지사 나세제제 제데 나세 삼게네 람사 오 할레디 네구도 센데니 시네오 샬레오 코르게다 나디 고구메스 나디 되오메스 코르게야 지사 다양 나선도 파죠 지잘라토도 어딘가를 고구도 센데니 짜잘라데 잡게야 지사 땡하 세드 지네 샨다 통도 아니 어딜레데 나야 그래서 르연된 치그레스 뱅가 얘기하다 지사한테 삼나 세베 삼노들 이거래 제래 나 세베 삼들이야 나 세베 삼노들 니용거 지당한저 나 세베 나지 여러 왕어 이봐 통야 지당 나 라신 두바 진비 진바 세드 니용거 다 제수 마지 나 세베 삼노 간시 리도 세베 한시 파심주 바제 심주 제고걸 받아
The arisal of anger brings harm to ourselves, and certainly in relation to the degree that we express it, it brings harm to others too. This is fairly obvious to see, and with some investigation, one can come to recognize the harm that follows from the other afflictions, such as pride and attachment. These too, with some knowledge, some analysis, one can come to recognize as harmful. But these all arise from the ignorance of self-grasping. This is much more difficult to recognize, but it is crucial to do so because it is the root cause of all our unwanted pain. So this self-grasping, this ignorance of self-grasping, is a consciousness that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears, which is as if it exists by way of its own essence, its own defining characteristics, its own inherent nature. And from grasping at the self as existing in this way comes the wish of, I want. And from I want, this I want is an expression or is attachment. And from this we pull others close for our own self-interest. And also from the thought of self-grasping comes, I don't want. This is anger, where we push others away so as to protect the self. So there are two eyes, and these we need to investigate. There's the one type of eye which I've just described, which is an ignorance. It does not exist. It's the eye that we grasp at as existing in a way that it does not. This eye does not exist, but yet we believe it does. And then there is the conventional eye, the ordinary eye that we refer to. I'm sitting, I'm listening. So these two we need to come to investigate, come to understand and recognize.
nga sa di ganesh du sebe yang jing nga di ganesh du sebe da du simji lol ya ganesh du sen na samta de kapla nga sa di nga zo lol ya nang yo du ka la ya ma do korong wen drup du ba chi shen ka la ya ma do korong wen drup du ba chi nang go re cha nga ran zo gi din na wa na shin ji yo re sam jin bi gi jin ba chi yo de di nga ra shin ju ba jin ba jin ba si wo 제산데 영원바 차상 영세계 자와 규디될 때는 뭐래시래. 제산 두치는 삼도는 하세 영원바 차상 딜은 하세데 간에도 스비 심주바 두 심주제도 양아도 두 삼다제로 삼날 삼다데 하세데 직 롤바샤되바 임바들라 나조 수보다 데서 강라 마되바 코롱 왜네 줍되바직 나조 롤레 능겨바디 거기 나조 심주지나 하고 인서와다 되네게 이제도 안디 딘나와 나시 요래 선배 삼로디 나 라신 유튜버 진바세야 되리스 강라마다 랑원 유튜버 나와디다 라신 유튜버 낭다 나 라신 유튜버 세야지레스 데네디 진비진바 나 라신 유튜버 진바레 지다다 델레 데네 아주 녀모 바타지 기기도 세베다디 심주치고로 와다 디하고 거다 신체 심주치야 돼.
There is a process, a sequence here that we all need to go through. So many of you have received many teachings on this topic. So you're already progressing through this process. First, one needs to recognize the role that the afflictions play in our life, to see that they are harmful, to see that they are our true enemies. They and they alone are the cause of our pain and misery. Seeing that, curiosity arises. What is their root cause? We've heard that it is the ignorance of self-grasping. But that is mere theory still. But from this curiosity, one will investigate. And the first point to investigate, to see if this theory that the ignorance of self-grasping is the root cause of all suffering, is, so how does this I appear? So the self, the I, the person, appears in the same way as all phenomena do appear to us. It appears as if it is self-existent. So there are a lot of synonyms here which are useful because they come at it from different approaches. But the I, like other phenomena, appear to exist by way of their very own essence. They have their own nature. So the self appears, our I, appears to exist by way of its very own nature, to be self-existent. So this is how the self, like all other phenomena, appear. Then this appearance is grasped at by a consciousness, believing that the self exists in the way that it appears. And this process is, as I've mentioned, is the same for all phenomena. They appear to us as if they exist by way of their own nature. And we grasp at them as existing in this way. This is the ignorance of true grasping, or the ignorance of self-grasping. Grasping at the phenomenon as existing in the way that it appears, which is by way of its own nature. And grasping at this is the very root cause, this consciousness that grasps, is the very root cause of all our afflictions, all our suffering.
콜로마 추가 증원이나 로마 추가 진배나 등원이나 된다라 나디 나와나시 유대 봐 책으로 봐. 세상 등원이나 되니기 좀 로디 마추가 진다. 그 매바서야 매어로다. When is go you never say never. Never say mena dini, Nyomo Papa Tuya Yomare. Didn't sang Tarbada could think it was said the Nyomo Bachasan, Dunga Yushazan never say to a never. Dimena Gedina Dunga Yungurma, Dunga Zang never say to a mere, that Tarbata Tamjikim go to a never charugor. Dinigi. Sisanda, Dini in Zada, Dinig sometimes that Dick never say to a man in the Suneta, Dunga never say Yomare, say to a man. Di meba soya ke dana bezu shena kala kharar ma tebu juya marwa. Tisa dini enzang, da di meba soya tuku de mindu, ko ngoye ne sula samba nawa na shinji ngadi, kala ma da rangwan rupa nawa na shinji duwe mindu sepe ke da shimju shayare. Da di nyomongpa di meba soya tuku yo na, nyomongpa ki eke sawa di meba soya tuku ora. Di meba soya tuku yo na, dina dunga seya yore, tarpa toya yore, sanjo koma toya yore, sachi li yorwa da. That's all called the Nigi, then Marik Padi, Zimbilo dida, Co Zimba Nashi, Nesula, Nadi do a Mindu Cheva Chere. When Nesula Yoba Yedena, got a Taratoya Mere. When you saw Yoba Mevana, then Dilo the Loksha Chatter, then Lodi Notary, then Notary Meva so to a Yediba Chago Regirwa.
This process, when one engages in, hopefully will lead to curiosity arising. When you get a feel for, as first of all, that the afflictions cause us our pain and misery, that curiosity will lead us to seek its root cause. Understanding the root cause, we come to look, so then, how does the I appear? Is it as it is presented to me or not? We need to come to recognize this for ourselves. And then, we need to, when we get to see how the I does appear to us, again, we need curiosity to inspire us, to spur us on, to investigate. Does the I exist in the way that it appears or not? I'm told again and again in these teachings, it does not. But merely hearing this does not lead to any freedom. I have to look for myself again and again. From this curiosity, we then investigate. And this is crucial, because if the I exists in the way that it appears, it means the way that it appears is in accordance with reality. Or to express it in normal language, the way of appearing is its way of existing or way of abiding. If that were to be the case, that the I does exist by way of its own nature, as it appears to be, that would mean the consciousness that grasps at it would be in accordance with reality. It would not be a wrong consciousness, but it would be a consciousness in accordance with reality. So that means it's not a consciousness that we could eradicate through wisdom, because it is already in accordance with reality, which means this consciousness grasping at the self as existing by way of its own nature, that leads to all the afflictions and our suffering could not be eradicated. Which means suffering couldn't be eradicated, our afflictions couldn't be eradicated, which means there's no liberation would be possible because we couldn't be liberated from suffering. So this we need to find out for ourselves, not merely hear the words, but again and again investigate. And when we do so, we come to see that if the self does not exist in the way that it appears, if this appearance is not in accordance with reality, then the consciousness that grasps at it as if it did exist in the way that it appears, this is a wrong consciousness, an ignorance. And if it is an ignorance, it can be eradicated through the contrary consciousness, wisdom. That means, if ignorance is eradicated, and all its resulting afflictions would also be eradicated, and therefore, suffering would cease. True cessation would be achieved. Liberation, or nirvana, liberation from suffering, would be achieved. And enlightenment would be possible too. So therefore, it is absolutely indispensable that we gather knowledge and we investigate based on that knowledge, coming to see if the self exists in the way that it appears or not. Is the appearance in accordance with reality or not? This is essential to determine.
On the name Zanda, the Nigi, Na, soon now the Kalama Rangman, now and I think you do Minus, Jeba Chidion, to that, Dende to Sene, and Dende sometimes Nangadi, can do see the Pumpit in the Jeba Jana, some semi tend to Jeba Jana, Kisinama, that time we should start in Hashi, do Jeba Jetu, and the Gansam Chilia, Tamalia, and Jinigi, do Jeba Chidu, had it now and I think may do Jeba Chidu, didn't Hadi Gaim, don't say. 东山恰如来去，东山起码都你能够有嘛来，东山是通过来去，就是东山是通用的，但你给结巴去，俺的没吧，就东山起码都通过嘛，通用的，那东边也通过来去了吧？就是东山通用的，这些俺要讲了嘛，让我们这边那完了，有的是被金巴的。 地界东上通才有结了，俺上面当一堆这些落地，它落雪的下，落出些下是不好过土过的，落雪麻过。其实那在落雪麻过，可能这一把好过样的，那可帮土都是，可帮也有把帮土的没把水都，其实那他把的东半夜多样的，真的他把土有把多过的，三角高帮土要的好过土，前面也把你过的，可牛毛把帮土少不能接把帮土有把它好过土过的，真的现在。 안 동반이 되니게 통해도 되니 안 고미알이야 매바서야리야다 즉 배절 마선에 즉 시우지 슈첨부지 두고 봐 근데 가서 교인지 세 두고요 봐도 세부하고 교인이 매바서고 이 매바도 매바서고요 봐지 디야 하고 세 매바서 두고요 봐도 하고요도 된대 매바서야래 배선 아니 슈첨부지 두고 그래지 제가 디네자 디 동상 통해도 동반이 통고래시 난 제가 디 다 되니게 또 별로디 동상 또 별로디 야네 검전에 야 누가 철철 땅고래스 진짜 당한 저 계신 소다 주에디 샤산디레 디고 슈고로 당한지 진짜 녀몽바 자완의 방바도 동방이 또 별로도 고고래스 진짜 디 공바인다 녀몽바 사변 자와디 고 매바수 녀몽바 자와디 매바수데 델리아 되셔 코로 마잘라서 바기야요 말레스 디마게는데 랭아 바사요 말레 랭아바 마사나 되네 코발에 끼어요 말에 되게나 동아요 말에 진짜 기니 대화니 대화 용거리스 세디 온두시네 제가 되네 자다 동방이 되게 심부시고 제스는 송고야 돼 김제로 들어와
So in the meditation I'm outlining one first comes to recognize how the object, the self, appears, and then investigates to see whether the way that it appears is how it exists or not, is the way of appearing and the way of existing or abiding in harmony or in accordance or not. And in this part of their analysis, there are many techniques to use. Best to utilize is that of dependent arising, and I've explained the step of the meditation many times before. Thereafter, when it comes to the conclusion, through thorough analysis, that the self does not exist in the way that it appears. It is empty of existing in the way that it appears. Here, all that appears now is no longer this truly existent self, but that this self is empty of true existence. And all that appears is the pure empty state. And here one realizes emptiness. Thereafter, after realizing emptiness, one knows with absolute certainty, with a valid cognition, that this innate consciousness that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears by way of its own nature or essence is an ignorance, a wrong consciousness, and therefore can be eradicated through this very wisdom that has been cultivated already. And therefore, because it can be eradicated, liberation is possible. So here, when the yogin realizes this with a valid cognizer, all wavering, all flicker of uncertainty will be eradicated. And with all their energy and joy, they will strive to realize emptiness again and again. This will be their priority because they know it's possible. It's no longer mere theory. It's something they've experienced, and experienced at a deep and profound level. And therefore, with joy, with energy, they will repeatedly over a sustained period meditate again and again on emptiness, strengthening their wisdom realizing emptiness. So this process is what we've been covering in detail over these last many weeks. Here, through this whole sequence, we come to recognize ever more clearly through hearing and our own meditations that the root cause of our afflictions, the ignorance of self-grasping, can be eradicated. And the consequence of eradicating this ignorance is that our afflictions can no longer arise. The cause is gone, the result cannot come. Afflictions such as anger, attachment of any strength will never arise. And therefore, no contaminated karma will be accumulated, and therefore, no further uncontrolled rebirth in samsara will be taken. And liberation is attained. So this is what we've been looking at over the last many weeks.
Adi Dongbanyi said that Dongbanyi Ranshin Tripik, Dongpik, Ranshin Tripik, Dongba Dongsanti, Dongbanyi did as a mega said, and Mayinga said, Juba said, Tesoka Re said, that is in addition to Shed. Dongbanyi is a mega member, Chu Shen Pimbig, Mayinga Gam, Yana, Drubayina, Dedobe Lo, Mipam, Samada Jabber Gulas.
Last time then we concluded on page 21, where we had come to a section discussing non-affirming negations, affirming negations, positive phenomena. So we continue there in the middle page 21 with the paragraph starting, if emptiness were not a non-affirming negative, but were either an affirming negative, implying another phenomenon, or a positive phenomenon itself, then a consciousness realizing it would have observations or signs.
Mega said, Mayinga said, and Juba said, Cheti Chazan Su Dujaban Disumna Dudugore, Kashe Mega said Charu, Kashe Mayinga said Chagor, Kashe Juba said Chagor, Chazan Disumna Dudugore.
These three terms that we've been looking at. So we have a positive phenomena, a negative phenomena divided into two, non-affirming negatives and affirming negations, or affirming negatives. All phenomena can be included in these three, either as a positive phenomenon, a non-affirming negation, or an affirming negation.
Dini zada anenga Dongbanyi said disum the neck res or the Mayinga Mega Rebe, Mayinga Rebe, and Juba res and Dakares and the Ganzu Shim Shabena, Dongbanyi said the Mega res or Mega res, Mayinga Mare, Juba Mares order.
As we saw last time and are continuing with here, emptiness, the topic of this text, being a phenomenon, it will fall into one of those three. And which is it? A positive phenomenon, an affirming negation, or a non-affirming negation? Amongst those three, emptiness is a non-affirming negation.
또 돈이 두블로디게 랑원을 두비 동배 동상아지 통그마도 생가야 통고 말 동상아지 도고 마도 동상딜레 로소 현다지 가야 통고 말 마도 마도 와서 동반이 코로나다 가자 가자 라신 주바 가자 가자미 동상지리스 지자디 자 메가레스 월다.
Emptiness again is a non-affirming negation. So what this means is merely the object of negation has been eliminated, or only the object of negation has been eradicated. In this way, one has recognized that the phenomenon is empty of existing in the way that appears, empty of true existence, empty of existing by way of its own essence, empty of existing by way of its own nature. So that's a list of synonyms. But from those, one can hear that nothing else is implied. So when one realizes emptiness, one realizes that, for example, the phenomenon is empty of existing by way of its own essence. Nothing is implied. And all that appears to the realizing consciousness is a pure empty state, or emptiness. The pure empty state is all that is seen or perceived, nothing else. And therefore emptiness is a non-affirming negation. Let's look at these two types of negation. So again, emptiness is a non-affirming negation. So the words are quite clear in that something is negated and nothing else is affirmed. So that's a non-affirming negation. Something is negated and nothing else is affirmed. In the case of emptiness, the object of negation, true existence, existing by way of its own essence, is negated and nothing else is affirmed, because all that appears, all that is perceived, is the pure empty state, is emptiness. So this is a non-affirming negation. And affirming negation, the other type, is also a negation. Something is negated, but something else is implied or affirmed. So that is the difference. A non-affirming negation, an affirming negation, both being negations, something is negated, but with the one, something is affirmed or implied, and with the other, non-affirming, nothing is affirmed or implied. So the illustration of a non-affirming negation is emptiness. To give an illustration of an affirming negation, someone states that plain is without trees. Then what we know from the statement that plain is without trees is that something has been negated, trees, that plain is without trees, so trees has been eliminated or negated, but there is something still there, the plain. So therefore, something is negated, so it's a negative, but there is something affirmed, in this case, or implied, in this case, the plain, and therefore it is an affirming negation, because something is negated, but something is also affirmed or implied. Whereas a non-affirming negation, something is negated, but nothing is implied.
가자 가지고 찍다 마가 받치니 저 가자 되게 신 매바 신 매바데 하고 신 여바데 가지 신 가네 신 매바데 하고 디자고 디슈라 람사 탕디 여바하고도 하 탕디 하고도 지단 신 매베 탕세디기 라외 삼다 라외도 나저기 디 삼는나 나저 루게 가르하고 니하고 거래 신 여바데 신 여마레에서 신 여바데 가네 신 매바데 하고도 되네 탕 탕대하고 니하고 그래. 대지 동방에서는 라신이 주변 동 가면 라신이 동산에서 동산 걸어마도 생각이 하고 말해. 제 동산 집마다 하고 말해. 진짜 동산에서 동방인데 매가래서 진짜 신미배 탕세대 많이 가래서.
To go through the same two illustrations again. With the affirming negation, something is negated, but something else is implied, or we could perhaps say known. So in the illustration of that plain is without trees, what is negated is trees. So there's a negative without, and it relates to trees, so trees are negated. But the second object that is known is that there is a plane exists. So with the affirming negation, two things are known. One, something is negated or eradicated, and something else is implied or known. So the plane is without trees. Trees are negated, but one still knows plane. But with a non-affirming negation, there is something negated, but nothing affirmed. So with emptiness, the object of negation, true existence, is negated, but but nothing else is affirmed. With the affirming negation, the plane is without trees. What comes to mind is that there is still a plane. But with the non-affirming negation, with emptiness, all that appears to mind is emptiness. Because there is nothing else affirmed, hence a non-affirming negation.
탕lab나 두버리 탕lab이도 그런 하고 얼마도 찍 매바디 하고 금도와 탕lab이도 탕지열에 탕지열라 시키시도 탕코로 여바다 하고 그래마도 디녜라 탕디녜라 찍 가자 파 매바디 하고 가야 하고 그 말에 고투고 말 매바자 탕lab나 탕고롱 주바다 마인가 메가나 가르rel란 탕고론 주바리에서 탕세도 주바리에서 그래서 탕사하고 탕고론 여바지 하고 그러마도 찍가바디 가야 하고 그 말. 달 리메베 탕라여도 싱메베 탕라여도 싱메베 탕라여도 니하고 그래 싱메바디 싱여바디 아파가 싱기 동베 동바디 하고 아니 탕디 하고 니하고도 싱메베기 탕랍나 이 로디기 무슨 통야지 하고 즉 가서 니하고 그래. 다 탕라나 집을라나 이거 취 여바 찍으라 하고 그러마다 각자 가야 막아봐 찍하고도 그래. 찍하고 그래. 그래서 탕라는 주바레스. 니나시 당한 저기 봄바 가와 나나 차상 주바레스. 되네기달 사시 나나 되네기다 매도 나나 되네기다 되네기 차상 주바차를 주베리 가양 각자 가야지 막아봐지 찍고 여바나 주바레스 매도 나나 파메와데 가야 구고 메도 코론 구마데 가야 구미도 진짜 메도라는 주바레 디네 지카소레 가와라는 주바레 두스네 디네 하고 이렇게 차상을 주바레서 돼.
A few segments ago, I mentioned that all phenomena can be divided into either two or three categories. So all phenomena can be divided into either positive or negative phenomena. So that would be two. Or negative phenomena can be divided themselves into two, affirming and non-affirming negatives. So in that way, three categories. So an illustration of a positive phenomenon is something like the plane. We've already used the illustration to say that an affirming negation is the plane is without trees. But the plane itself, that is a positive phenomenon. There's no object of negation. If you just say that is a plane, nothing is negated. But something is affirmed, nothing is negated, so that is then a positive phenomenon. Or one could say a tree, a vase, a pillar, a flower. These are all positive phenomena. The other category are where phenomena are negated. So negative phenomena, with affirming and non-affirming. And the plane is without trees. There two things are known. With the positive phenomena, only one thing was known. The plane, for example, one thing. But the plane without trees, two things are known. One, there's been a negation. There are no trees. But there is a plane. So in that way, two things are known.
가자 가sam지마도 가야 또 하고 그러면 디니기 유디 가자 가sam들 메가스밍다 거와 달로디기 가자지 가지 현다지 하고 그거요바나 디 유디 림 싱메베 탕라들 라비오도 아니 로기 하고 그 그것은 가자지야 가 아니 탕코라 니가 니도 하고 그래서 그거는 많이 가래 지금 탕는 내가 많이 가래서 다 탕지불라네 주바레스 그래서 로이하고 가자 가양 까바다 하고 뭐 그런 집부 하고 마다 가자 가양 까바다 하고 말이죠. 네 통고 말아 되는자 주바레스 제가 로이 유디 하고 당의 토네 아니 메가다 마인가다 주바세는 숨리 경우를 지금마다 하고요 말 동상지마다 가자 가점마다先하고 그 말이죠. 만약에 니 하고 그래.
So, understanding the presentation of positive and negative phenomena, then we can one can divide all phenomena into whether they are positive or negative, and if negative, it means that there is something negated. There's an object of negation, and then there are two divisions, either affirming or non-affirming. If it's a non-affirming negative, two things are known. So in the illustration, the plain is without trees, plain is known, and that there are no trees is also known. So with a affirming negation, two things are known. With a positive phenomenon, only one thing is known. For example, plain or trees, one thing is known. So too, with a non-affirming negation, because nothing is affirmed, just something is negated. All that one knows is what's negated.
제자다 동반이디 메가레 마도 마인가 말에 주바야 말해시. 다 마인가 있나 가린 거스네 최신 편곡을 해서 최신지 편곡을 해라네. 최신 편비 마인가 감라도와 동반이디 마인가 말해서 마인가 있나 라신이 주바 가샤지 가지네 최신지 편곡 주바지 편곡을 해지. 최신 주바지 편곡 대지 리메베 탕라데 갈고선 리메베 탕 아세 행동메베 탕라도 신유여바지 가제 디가도 가라고서 탕디 하고 주바 최신 탕지 편용도 편미스나 하고 와 르이 하고 와서 르이 편바스는 르이 똑밤 진발라고 그래. 제사디 내게 편곡을 해서도 편곡을 제사 리메베 탕라도 탕디 시가서 신메베 탕라도 신디파 가네 가용도 갑라 난 슈르 람상 가르 하고 온 것은 최신 가라서 탕디 하고도 그래서 핑도와 니나시 동반이디 안에 마이가 있나 그 가자 동상 지금 랑원의 주변 동바디 동상 이제 랑원 주바디 파가야도 안에 동상이 통고를 니 멤버션다지 최신 주바지 통고디 통고 말했어 제사디 최신 뱀뱀 마이가 말했어다.
Looking at this first sentence of the paragraph, if emptiness were not a non-affirming negative, but were either an affirming negative, implying another phenomenon, so just looking that far. So we've heard thus far that emptiness is a non-affirming negation. Amongst the three, it is a non-affirming negation. But if it were, as he's presented here, in theory, if it were not a non-affirming negative, but an affirming negative, this would mean something is implied as well as negated. So so going back to the illustration of the plain is without trees, there is a negation, trees are negated, and a positive phenomenon, the plain, is implied, and therefore there is an affirming negation. Therefore, it is an affirming negation. And if emptiness were also an affirming negation, something would need to be implied. When emptiness is realized, something would need to be implied. Emptiness being the negation, then something needs to be implied. But nothing is. emptiness alone is what is known, is what is perceived. So therefore, it can only be a non-affirming negation.
다 동방인의 주바야 말이지. 주바이나 가짜지 까바디 마고 가짜 까바디 마통하지 그런 주바지 통고로 와. 지사 동방이 또베데 랑원의 주바디 민두 선비 랑원의 주바 동바 가짜 랑원의 주바디 까비게 동산의 통고를 가짜 까바 통고마도 가짜 마가바 주바지 통고 말와. 배능아서 이게 탕랐나 탕세 통로도 가로 탕고랑 통만데 가짜 까바 가야 통고 말와. 지산 주바로시네 데니시고 그래지. 지산 주바야 말해서 주바 있나 교행 가려 열었으니 로 동이도 로디기 가샤데 까바 많이 막아봐 콘 주바지 ኘ고 그래. 니 얘기민도 와 동방 있어야 되게 또 로디 랑원의 주바디 민도 선비기 통고래. 양랑원의 주바데 까바지 통고마도 막아비기 주바지 통고 말해서 지산 주바야 말해서 지산 동방이 주바 말해 마인가 말해 디니 마인 비김센 디레서 주바 있나 가짜 가야 까바지 구구 하고 말해 빈 탕랍도 주여바지마도 매바디 하고 구문도와 지산 주바 써야 돼 디레 최신 주바 써야 돼 지산 탕랍도 탕코롱 고아마도 직 매바지 구문도와 대지 신매배 탕랍도 갈라서 신 매바데 하고 매바지 하고도 여바지까지 매바지 하고도 와. 근데 슈라 탕디고 주바 여바데 하고도 와. 디나신 다 주바세디 있나 매바세디 가야 가자 까바데 마고 와지 그런 예되게 지금 하고 한데를 주바데 거래지. 지산데 동방인의 주바 말에 주바 있나 가서 동방인 또 벌로디기 가자 마가바지 그런 예되바지 내고 그래. 딩 얘기미도 동방이 또 별로 되게 랑원의 주바디 민도 선배 통고래서 지산 가자가 받은 게 거래지. 랑원의 마주 랑원의 주바디 가고로 랑원의 민도 선배 제 랑원의 주바 여바디 가고로 와 가지 동바디 통고로 와.
In this first sentence, if emptiness were not a non-affirming negative, and then we looked at, but we're either an affirming negative, implying another phenomenon. So I've just looked at that in the previous segment. So we continue, or a positive phenomenon itself. So if emptiness were not a non-affirming negation, but a positive phenomenon, that would mean there would be no process of seeking out and trying to eradicate the object of negation. Because if something is a positive phenomenon, for example, a plane, a tree, a pillar, a table, there is nothing to be negated. There is no object to be negated. All that would be required, as is required with a positive phenomenon, is something is known or recognized. There would be no, if emptiness were a positive phenomenon, there would be no attempt to eliminate anything at all, because there would be no object of negation. Just, if emptiness were a positive phenomenon, it would just need to be known or recognized. But emptiness is a non-affirming negation. It is not inherently existent. Emptiness does not exist by way of its own nature. Therefore, it is not a positive phenomenon.
다 가래 다 동방이디 마인가다 야네 마인가래 야네 주바래 라바이나 다 교행 가래 요래스나 야 데마 인나서 야네 주바 인나서로 대도별로 대미밤 참마다 제바 줄라서 대도별로 세 동이도 별로 되시고래 주바 인나 가래 요래스네 야네 동방이네 마인가래 라인 동방이 주바래 라바이나 교행 가래 요래스네 동방이 또 별로 대도 별로 되시 동방이 또 별로 돼 미밤 참마나 제바 줄라서 대바도 진주 그래서 된신차로 그래라 되다.
Continuing with the first line, here we come to the consequence. If emptiness were either an affirming negation or a positive phenomenon, now we come to the consequence, then a consciousness realizing emptiness, it would have observations or signs.
그래서 된신차로 그래라 와. 동방이 또 별로디 가르쳐 그랬으네. 동방이네 마인가 양 동방이네 마인가래. 야는 동방이네 주버를 납나. 동방이네 마인가 이나야 동방이 또 별로디 된신차 그랬어. 동반이 두바래 랍나야 동반이 또 별로 된신 차이 돼라다.
What observations or signs mean is that emptiness, if it were a positive phenomenon or an affirming negation, emptiness would be existent by way of its own nature, would be truly existent, established by way of its own essence. That would be the consequence. So to put the whole sentence together, if emptiness were not a non-affirming negation, but were either an affirming negation or a positive phenomenon, emptiness then would be inherently existent, exist by way of its own nature, essence, or characteristics.
나 된진 자기를 했을 때 한 직삼로 10초를 마다나 지게 로랴 차야 되스 가고래. 지난 된진 자기를도 된진 간의 자기를 했다. 동방인데 누가 있나 동요도 별로 된진 간의 자기를 했어. 자 어두스세요. 다 된진 간의 자기를도 동방이 이게 그랑은요 주비게 동상하지마 바 동방이 이게 랑은에 가사 랑은 두번 나와나 신 제발 가서만 동상하지 두고 와. 동상하지 또왜 디간이야? 아니 군주비 취 또왜 내 군주비 취도나 가사 또는 마다 신 또요 말와. 제가 가사디 대신 나와나 신 제발 가사 통구여번에 타마들 가사 통구여번에 가사 덴바도 가사 라신 두번 차서 가사디 니거로 와. 제니 니용거래. 니네 가사디 아니 라신 두번 차서 그래. 제 라신 두바 차와이나 디진별로디 에 라신 두바 진별로 차이거래. 진짜 된진 차로 그래. 진짜 동반이 가사 라신 두비기 동배 동사디야 또 그래. 가사디야 니기래라나. 다 마인가이나 가차디 가비 슈라 지 두바지 최신 두바지 니고 또 걸어와 또 로직이 또 걸어와. 디또 바나 가사에 대도 제바치디 가사 코론 또 그래. 진짜 가사 라신 두비 가네 가사 또 그래라나. 되네 가사디 这你到这呢捏把差了过来，捏把差都捏不定的捏把真不落的点进差了哇，其实东西都不落点进差了才这些我就这样去。啊，对，主办呢，但买一个几把差了过的，点进差上的跟着差了点差个来才差上的气候了哇。
To take these words and understand them is a little difficult, but to really see the purpose, one needs to think about this in some detail. So what is being presented here is the consequences that would follow if emptiness were not a non-affirming negation, but were either a positive phenomenon or an affirming negation. So let's flesh out a little bit the consequences that would follow if emptiness were a positive phenomenon or an affirming negation. Because what does it mean to be investigating in this context? In this context, what are we investigating? We are investigating to see how phenomena such as the self exist in reality. This is what we want to come to know. How does the self exist in reality? Then, if one is investigating the self or the person and comes to find that the person that appears to exist by way of its own essence or nature, that is how it appears, does indeed exist by way of its own essence or nature, and one finds the very essence of the person, the nature by which the person is established, then the person will be a positive phenomenon, and it will have been found by the consciousness seeking reality, and therefore this consciousness would believe that they had found the essence or the nature by which the person exists, and this then is a positive phenomenon, or approached in a different way would be an affirming and negation. And the consequence of that, the further consequence of that then is true grasping would be reinforced, because the consciousness of true grasping, or grasping at phenomena as truly existent, we would believe it is in accordance with reality. Because phenomena exist in a particular way, we grasp at that appearance as being true, And that's the consciousness of true grasping. Then we investigate and we see, yes, indeed, the way the phenomena appear, existing by way of their own essence or nature, is actually how they exist. So therefore, this consciousness of true grasping is in accordance with reality. Because the self or the person has now been found. The very essence or nature that establishes the person has been found. So that would be the consequence if emptiness were either an affirming negative or a positive phenomenon.
Denzin tadage nyembo migurwi gyonyo rejere.
And continuing with the paragraph, thus the arisal of grasping at an observed object as truly existent would not be prevented. In that case, it would not be possible for the exalted wisdom realizing emptiness to be the antidote to all awarenesses, of true grasping.
Deta nasi di dongpa yi di yana mayinga yana juba yimba ina se ora yimba ina mikpa tela mini se de dongpa yi tela mini mikpige ane denzin kiyo go kege mares pena azo dongpa yi wani sina dongpa yi doyong du denzin di ane meba charo kago orwa denzin kiya go kago or denzin kichu go marwa chita rashing rang wani du pena kansa se de kansa de rang wani du zao gyuni mindu sembe samlo le kiye de ba ina kansa rashing rang wani du ba du sembe samlo de kigo go kago orwa ko lo masana gyabshe go ko yong chu go marwa ko chisa da dongpa yi de mayinga ina na dongpa yi to zimbi lo digi yoba ina digi ane denzin di ka thuk ma re jere ka thuk ma denzin gi re jere kasan ko dongpa yi kasan chue shin ruba ji ko zin du go wa chesa demba ruba zin du go za demba du deji demba ruba zin de ba ina ane demba ruba ke le ka thuk go ma wa.
Thus, the arisal of grasping at an observed object as truly existent would not be prevented. So this I've already covered in the immediately preceding segment, that if emptiness, what thus refers to, if emptiness were either a positive phenomenon or an affirming negation, then one would come to the outcome of one's analysis that the self or the phenomenon exists by way of its own nature or essence as it appears. And then the wisdom or the consciousness here that one believes has now realized emptiness would have actually realized that phenomena exist in the way they appear, and this would not eradicate true grasping at all. Whereas the purpose of the wisdom realizing emptiness is that it eradicates true grasping, the cause of all our suffering. But in fact, if emptiness were a positive phenomenon or an affirming negation, analysis would just lead to the strengthening of true grasping, because we believe that true grasping is in accordance with reality. In other words, to say again, we would believe that phenomena do exist in the way they appear, because true grasping is the consciousness, the grasping consciousness that grasps at phenomena as existing in the way they appear, that their appearance is true grasping. So we believe that consciousness of grasping is in accordance with reality. And therefore, we would be reinforcing it, not at all eradicating it. So this then is the meaning of thus, the rise of grasping at an observed object as truly existent would not be prevented.
Mayinga dongpa yi de mayinga da chupa kangro yinba yina ne dongpa yi kasa dongpa yi to bige lo digi ane denzin ka thuku meba yina ane dongpa yi to bige yeshi di denzin tadagi nyembo chagi mares nyembo mi gyuwa misis nyembo chagi mares tizada denzin dongpa yi to bige lo digi ane gomne denzi di meba so tukmana denzi nyembo chego marwa denzi nyembo lana denzi meba so gorwa chesa di tongpa ni to bi lo di ane denzi nyembo chadu mares.
Continuing to the next sentence, in that case, it would not be possible for the exalted wisdom realizing emptiness to be the antidote to all awarenesses of true grasping. Or to put it even more bluntly, it couldn't be an antidote to a single awareness of true grasping because it would not be contrary to it. In fact, it would reinforce true grasping, let alone eradicate it, because it would believe that true grasping is in accordance with reality.
동방이 또 별로데 딘징이 녀보 마이나 동방이 또 별로데 가지고나 딘징 빵투 말와 지버빵 딘징 빵투 말에 딘징 빵 마도나 아니 텔레키네 되자 홍롱아를 녀마라 소바 빵투게 매래제 매만자 지다 디바 뽕아야 미시버 주로스 지사다 딘징 동방이 또 별로데 공발레데니 디바 뽕아야기 뽕 시그마레스 뽕투 마레스 미시버 주로스 디바 뽕아야 미시버 주로스.
And if the wisdom realizing emptiness were then not the antidote to true grasping, then no matter how much one meditated on emptiness, because of this mistake that the meditator were making, it could not be the antidote to true grasping. It couldn't damage true grasping at all, and therefore wouldn't weaken, or wouldn't even weaken, the resulting afflicted minds. Thus, the sentence continues. In that case, it would not be possible for the exalted wisdom realizing emptiness to be the antidote to all awarenesses of true grasping, and would be incapable of eliminating the obstructions.
동방이 또 별로디 덴지 임비 괜치 차기래서 괜니바 가려운 거래라나 동방이 뒤kom발에 때네 덴진 깨와요 고가도 말해서 괜니 숨바 가려서는 동방이 또 별로디 아니 덴진 타다게 녀보 차기 말해서 나 시바 가려서는 나 덴진 녀보 마찬나 동방이 kom발에 때네 녀모바 디버방도 말해서 어다디 데니스 퀸 데니 용거래 데니자 동방이 시대 메가레 마도 마인가도 두바인 라교 말에 데나 인도스여베나 임바이나 퀸 데니데네 용거래 에세지 온도스체네 송거다.
In brief then, what this has presented is that to make very clear to the meditator that emptiness can only be a non-affirming negation. It is not an affirming negative or a positive phenomenon. And this is made clear not through this mere statement, but through the reasonings that have been presented. And the reasonings are required so that the meditator can be sure, based on reasons, that they are coming to the correct conclusion in the meditation. And these reasons are that if emptiness were either a positive phenomenon or a negation that affirms something, an affirming negation, that so-called wisdom realizing emptiness could not eradicate true grasping, because in fact it would strengthen true grasping. And not being an antidote then to true grasping, it wouldn't weaken, let alone eradicate the afflictions. And therefore it could not have any impact at all on the obscurations. So such a mistake would prevent any progress towards the attainment of liberation. And therefore, this is an important point.
간제래 동방이 안서 때다 동방이 많이 가다 저자하고 둡니다. 진짜 동방이는 파 제바 주고 간전 제바 체도 파 bene sab le and dombanile ji manga mendo sambeki koronzo manga inside sambeki doshi kiyoya da dine yungu yeserwada 파시 인사리 마인가 알람 인사리 선배들이 용기서와 디네 인자 다지산 디네기 동반이데 마인 다디네기 마인가 말에서 메가레서 다 디네기 흉멍보다라야 두부어레 메가레 마인가 인바이나 디네디네 그 용구레서 안다디디 송와나신 전에
Presentations such as this will seem a little far removed from our own experience. And that's okay, because it really is quite far removed from our own experience of meditating on emptiness. But if we do continue over a sustained period with effort on meditating on emptiness, in time we will progress and we will approach an actual realization of emptiness. And then doubts like this will arise. And we can say this with certainty because in the past, former masters in Old Tibet made this error. There are texts that we can see from the ancient times where they asserted that emptiness is an affirming negation. So many texts were thereafter written establishing that emptiness cannot be an affirming negation, and if it were, consequences such as I've mentioned tonight would follow, and therefore, and for other reasons too, it is a non-affirming negation and only a non-affirming negation. So for us, again, this is a little distant, but we gather the knowledge, we gather the imprints, and then later, when we do come close to realizing emptiness, such doubts may well arise, and then based on what we've heard here and previously, in our previous class, we will be able to skillfully guide ourselves in meditation to coming to the actual realization of emptiness.
동요 체매 원이라 도가 인바나다 동이 마인가인 선배게 도가 리교 말에 제가 동이를 봐 제바제 안가 제바도 띵서 거로제 동이 마도 봐제 디바라디와 안데니시 도가 사야게 리교 인서와데
Those who have actually realized emptiness, they have no such doubt. But in the process to the attainment of that realization, doubts like this arise. So it arises in the continuum of experienced meditators approaching an actual realization of emptiness. When emptiness is realized, these doubts are eradicated.
노래하디 나중에 가리나르 바지 지레가 지레제 갈간선 말에는 노래하리 말봐. 지금 뭐라기네 마땅하래 뭐라 노래 양을 쉬어야 해요 말봐. 뭐라 땅 귀네 땅 마심을 따면요. 다 뭐라 옷 고로 땅신 배 야구라 땅 마신 배네 뭐라 땅 로제 현달에 다비하다 양을 쉬어야 되네 용구와 되네 용구려. 안디 멤비게 땅 아주게 뭐라 섬다나 되네. 디 멤비게다 되네게 현다 신의 로주 두위네다. 신의 두비 갈간선 신의 간선 갈간선 심내 바마 간선 레어두 되네 진화 참을 레어두 신의 주소선 비게 될 노르시네 근데 주고신의 고면 노트 차 용거를 신의 기내 마주발라 진화 참을 투치네 노래하기는 용거 말에 지상 그 모델 마선에 그 땅지는捐学 다외디 모델 갈간선 오스타신 빼야고 땅 마시면 노래하기 전부 책도 와 디나시 띵에진 기내 신의 마주 마고발라 다 신의 톱선선 비게 노래하기는 용거 말에 자 신의 줍제 셈내라서 막 갈간선 레데 되네 진화 참모대다 띵에진 신의니도 고투제 진화 참을 때도 다 띵의 신의 톱선선 비게 다 신의 레샤선 비게 노트 차제 난 디캬장 검대와 용거래 자 디나시 동이를 제바제 제바야 갈간선을 동용원에 마도와제 동이 집에지도 되네기 노트를 리고 그래서 간지래 가지고 롭종을 막 신의 주변에 신의 검제 신의 원에 마도와제 신의도 갈간선 레세 디바라를 노트 차야 모자에네 오스탄 고로탄신 빼 야고 싶어 땅 마신 바라들 노트 차야 디나신 아주 갈자라로 갈 수 있는 좋아 즉 자라로 수비나 뒤에 쇠마신의 노트 차야 말와 제가 간섬지 야 오스신 뿌이다고 쇠마신의 노트 차야기 닝아데 책으로 제가 되네자 다 되네래다 네되는 마 셰바디에 다 지제셰 자도 다 뿌이다고라지 야고라 신면에 양징의 노트지 제셰자에 용시 버와 오스 제셰 잡심마제 차상 뿌이다고라 신면에 되네 노트 제셰자에 용시 버와
Now, just to emphasize the point of why, for people like us, we should make effort to listen to a teaching like this and to read on topics like this, is because, for example, as someone who's never driven a car, I've incurred no faults that come from driving a car. And at some point, you were all in the same position. You'd also never driven a car and therefore had incurred no faults of driving. But you had heard a lot about how to drive, the dangers that can be experienced, what to do, just from being young, from being a passenger, from being in society. So you gathered knowledge. Then you were trained, you taught, and then you were starting to drive, first accompanied and later unaccompanied. So there was this process of not being a driver and having no experience, but slowly gathering a little bit of knowledge. Then you started to learn a bit more intensely, and you built on that knowledge you had picked up. Then you started to have lessons, and you were actually, sort of driving, and you were really relying heavily on this little bit of knowledge because your skill behind the wheel was weak. Then you got better, and maybe you've got to the point where you could drive alone, but you would still be quite uncomfortable behind the wheel, especially if you met a rare circumstance, an unexpected circumstance. Then you'd really need to rely on your training beforehand. And if your training had been good, you would get through that difficult situation well, as opposed to just a bit of luck. So that is a clear analogy to what we're doing here. Here, we're gathering knowledge about a level of meditation which is still well beyond us. But if we persevere with effort, we will attain that level ourselves. And then these lessons and our further reading on this will be invaluable. So, and also later, when you, like me, come to the point of explaining a topic such as this, one can only explain as precisely as one has gathered knowledge and gained experience. Beyond one's own experience based on knowledge, one is quite likely to make some errors. So therefore, to be able to help others as well as possible, we gather as much knowledge and apply that. Even when that knowledge is for further along the road, we gather that when we have the opportunity. And this way, later, we will be more skilled and we can be of more benefit to others.
Shine tu so sampe nor chenene telecom che de dinge de tu she yungore shine gyune madu bala ane di nora yo mares
And this is the same with other topics. So for example, that of calm abiding. There, the actual attainment of calm abiding is quite, maybe you could say, elusive, or maybe not deceptive, maybe elusive, in that when one's approaching it, one may well think one has attained it. And therefore, if one has not been trained well, and if one is not being guided well, an error can be made. And one may end up thinking, I've attained calm abiding. And therefore, think one can now proceed with fully fledged calm abiding. But yet one has not yet attained it. So then we can conclude here for tonight. If you have some questions, then please feel free to ask.
Amen.
Sure.
At the beginning we were talking about how when self-grasping arises, then we have attachment or aversion. Just noticing from my experience, like when attachment or aversion arises, it seems you can notice it, right? It's quite strong, the feeling, or even if it's not strong, you can still notice it. The self-grasping before that, you can't. I don't know. For me, I don't feel like I can notice it arising in my mind. Is that because is self-grasping like a neutral feeling, like pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral? Is that why it's like more difficult to recognize, or just because I'm just not analyzing now? And then the The second question was, like realization of dependent arising, is that a positive phenomenon? And if so, like why does that not lead to, what do you call it, like grasping at true existence?
The first question then is, when afflictions arise, I can notice these quite readily, but the self-grasping that they arise from, this is really difficult to notice. And so the afflictions will be accompanied by a feeling, pleasant or unpleasant, but is self-grasping accompanied by a neutral feeling, and therefore it's difficult to realize, difficult to notice. And then the second question is the realization of dependent arising, or is dependent arising a positive phenomenon? And if so, why does it not lead to the strengthening of true grasping?
다신 대 하고 할 samnata 직 samnates마다네 하고 하고래 가서는 좀 검시요 말와 제 다신데 간에 제 잔디 디레 다신데 갈래가다도 신행아도 다제 하고 해야지 간에 하고 그래서네 나보아들 직 다데데 되샤 코르가제 나세베 samnati 기기요 받이 가서 하고도 와데 제가 나세베 samnati 기기도 하고도 제가 나세베 samnati 코르도 갑라 나세디 나도 로야 나나디 간에서 난구도 세비게 디 데니기 디 심주리 약보시 제고 거래요. 디 제용도 갑라네 고 나세디 나서 풍부하다 셈다 강라야 마디오 바체 코로나랑 뭐니 예디바르시 난고르다. 난고르디 데니지 요래서 베셈 한기지 요랑 저게 한기링 아셈 한기 요르다 가지고 레로 야고하고도 말와다. 그래서 데니 요래서 베삼로지 글리제 집주지대가 하고 인이로다. 이제 하고도 거래. 당보다 가지고 낭다네 간에서 난구도 삼다. 딘나나 삼다도 안도신 딜 삼로 나는 지도 삼다가 풍부하다 갈라마도 나나 나신 요래서 베삼로 한기도 요되래. 근데 디디래 당아도 두스네. 저 삼당 거로와다. 초와스나 초와다님도 지단도 초와 예도 요르데 나가진 게도 나주기 초와지기 뒤편에 대디 말해.
The difficulty that you recognize is really a valid difficulty, and this is not just for you, but for really everyone. The method, though, to come to recognize the self-grasping, or the true grasping, is not through looking through feelings, but in the following way. So we tend, when we look, we can recognize our sense of self, or our sense of self-identity, our I, our self. But we need to go further than with this and try to really see how it appears to us. And this is difficult because we are so habituated to this appearance of an I and grasping it as existing in the way that it appears, the self-grasping. We are so habituated to it that it's almost as if it's invisible to us. So therefore, we need to again and again be trying to get a feeling for the self that appears as if it is independent of our body and our mind, our physical mental aggregates, that appears as if it is not affected by them. Whatever is happening in our body, whatever is happening in our mind, our sense of self stays fixed, unmoving, unchanged. This is what we need to recognize. And it's then from grasping at that the afflictions come. So that is difficult to recognize, but the way to recognize it is to keep looking. To keep looking to see, can I recognize how it appears? And this mind of true grasping is innate to us. It's very deep within. It naturally, spontaneously arises for all of us. Hence, it's so difficult to recognize. Okay. Then I'll ask the second question. The reason that it's so difficult to recognize is because we don't think about this. We have a continuous stream of thoughts, very few of them about this. But the more we can think about how is my I appearing now and now and now, it'll become easier for us.
Tende koran drupa ina de densin shukcher densin koran tende lande drupa rwa dene 지사디 디디스고 디다니 카 덴데세 덴진세 디데시세 디가서 랑원에 두고 덴버 나와 나신 누구 민도 제바 제신 타면 타마라 아니 가사 예 진바인다 근데 덴버 두바 자로 그래와 딱던 제는 예바죠 덴데세디 나오게 지상 그런 유단께 가르스 띵기도 스베데 디데 베네 가르카르 띵기도 스베 제바 지제마도 그런 나와 나신 누구의 민도스 제지지가 말아 덴데 세딩 아주 파심주지는 예여로 예여로 근데 규 제보진의 규 가르를 때는 기술습이 파심주지도 규델을 때는 기술습이지 델을 때는 기술습이 예여로 와 지사디 덴지게 와요 말해 그래서 제바 제단 보러 가가라 와대.
Then your second question, dependent arising is a positive phenomenon. The reason it doesn't strengthen the grasping at true existence, like emptiness, the realization of emptiness would, if it too were a positive phenomenon, is because the mode of investigation, or the way one investigates, is completely different. So with emptiness, one is looking to see if the phenomenon exists in the way that it appears or not. And then one does analysis, having recognized how it appears, to see if it exists in the way that it appears or not. So that's the mode of analysis, or the way of analyzing for emptiness. And then one comes to realize that the phenomenon is empty of existing the way that it appears, and an emptiness then is a non-affirming negation. But with dependent arising, one is rather looking at the person to recognize that, or the person, the phenomenon, that it is a dependent arising. For example, dependent on causes. So here too, one is engaging in analysis, but the method of analysis, of investigation, is completely different. Therefore, whilst the result of investigating through dependent arising is a positive phenomenon, dependent arising is a positive phenomenon, that result isn't that true grasping is strengthened. So in brief, the reason is because the way of investigating is different.
So when dependent arising is analyzed, do you still have like observations or signs, but it still doesn't lead to true grasping?
So when one investigates through dependent arising, as we saw in the text, does it lead to observations or signs, but without true grasping being strengthened?
주바는 마인가다 주바 있나? 지산
Dini also Tenjo Kenchini, so Tarojena, Dini di Tsenma Kiekide.
Tsenma said Tsenma said Demba
Yanga, Drupa Yina,
Jizanti
Deto Pelo, Mikba, Tsenma Dangcheba.
Jizan Tsenma said Demba Juba.
Dini Tenjo Tarojetan, Tenjo Yina, Dini Yu Tope Yube, Tsenma Dangcheba.
Tiki Maro, Tendegi Jeba Chitaji, Tinjin, Jawa, Bene Tinjin, Jawa Church, Bene Nuguru China, Ticatali Tini Kigus, but Getanti Horon, Julipa, Chidu, and Horon, Ju Cor Delatin, Jawa, how Tatu Jeba Chisi, Zosa, then Pat Jeba Jawama, Horasan, you got it in the key to Kareli Tingu, Jeba Chedu, Horon Gulet, Kigo, but the Tichigorwa. That it is Samba said the Temba Jubas, Temba Jubas order. Samba said the Rashin Juba, Chadu Kuriela. Yungudi. She said, Nango or the Temba Juba now and Ashin Duga Miduchiba Chigo Marwa. She said, You can see it in the Kigores, and Karli Tingors, poor dance of Cutis Jeba Chigomato, now and Ashin Ganis to see Jeba Chigo Marwa. Just that, Gudil Chebajo, Koron, you Saban, Delatin, Saban, the Hawasana, Chebaje, the Tazosa, the Temba Juba Zinyaskayama. Nugma now, and now I'll take go Marwa.
So when one is investigating a phenomenon through dependence arising, the technique of dependence arising, one is looking to see, for example, just taking from causes, how does the sprout come about? It comes about in dependence on causes. Here one is not challenging that the sprout appears as truly existent. So therefore, it's not that now it appears with signs or as truly existent, it already appears as truly existent, and we're not trying to eradicate that appearance. Rather, one is looking, does it come about is it independent or dependent? And one is looking to see that it is actually dependent on causes. So therefore, one is not actually challenging here that it is the appearance of true. We're not challenging true existence, because the mode of investigating or the way of investigating is different. Okay.
Is it possible to realize emptiness through just depending on analyzing dependent arising and not looking at the non-affirming negation side, like just looking at dependent arising, or do you eventually have to analyze emptiness too?
So is it possible to realize emptiness just through the technique of dependence arising without reflecting on emptiness? Yeah?
Meditating Mega some danger ransom that one. Carson a danger ransom to Tianjin, Jawa, Jua, Shenji, Tuba, Tonga Ducabla, Kala Matuba, Rang when Juba de Gatu water. But the Mainga that Juba that is Mega some tango mare.
Yes, it's possible to realize emptiness just through reflecting on emptiness, on dependent arising, with no need to talk about positive and negative phenomena. Because when one is looking at a phenomenon through dependent arising, it appears as being independent, truly existent. But then you realize it's not. It is dependent. It's empty of appearing, empty of existing in the way that appears because it is dependent. So therefore, there would be no need to think about affirming and non-affirming negations. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.